Hello, my friend. Today I will tell you another long-forgotten legend. Close your eyes and let the magic transport you to Middle-earth. Our journey begins.
Long ago, when the world was yet young and the great kingdoms of elves and men stood proudly across Middle-earth, there lay in the frozen north a dark and dreadful place, Carn. Once, the seat of the Witch King of Angmar, it brooded under perpetual cloud, its black towers thrust like broken fangs into the gray sky, though the Witch King himself had long since been overthrown and driven into the shadows beyond mortal reach. The evil he had summoned to Carn clung like a poisoned mist to the crumbling stones. Far to the east, beyond the misty peaks of the gray mountains and the green fields of Dale, the dwarves of the north remembered Carn with a bitter heart. They recalled the days when their kin were hunted and slain by the sorcerous armies of Angmar. They remembered the burning of halls, the loss of treasure, and the spilling of royal blood. For the dwarves forget neither slight nor sorrow, and the memory of the Witch King's terror burns still like coals in their hearts. In the Iron Hills, where the forge fires never slept and the hammer's ring echoed across stone and vale, a council was called. Thrallin, a lord of stern countenance and iron will, gathered the chieftains beneath his hall. By firelight they spoke of vengeance and renewal. No longer, they swore, would Carn fester like an open wound upon the land. They would march, armed and resolute, and reclaim the ancient halls beneath the mountain where once their forefathers had delved before the coming of the shadow. Yet this was no small venture, and danger was thick about the path. Many wise among the dwarves counseled caution. Some spoke of strange sightings in the northern wastes, ghostly lights that flickered in ruined towers, beasts twisted by old sorceries, and men whose hearts had turned black with ancient oaths. Still, Thrallin's voice was like a drum in the darkness, calling the stout-hearted to action. "The longer we leave the wound unhealed," he said, "the deeper the rot shall grow." And so it was that banners were unfurled, axes were honed to a keen edge, and mail was hammered bright under the skillful hands of the smiths. From the Iron Hills came many proud warriors, and from the scattered halls of the gray mountains others answered the call. Grimly, son of Groen, brought a company of axe-throwers skilled in mountain war. Dane, a grim veteran, led miners and tunnel fighters whose eyes were sharp even in utter blackness. From all corners of the north, the dwarves gathered. Grim, determined, and bound by a common oath, their march began under a cold and sallow sun. The winter's bite was already in the air, though it was yet early in the season. Across rocky plains and treacherous hills they went, their heavy boots stirring the frost-rimed earth. Silent and watchful they traveled, wary of unseen eyes. Herds of caribou fled at their passing, and ravens wheeled overhead, cawing harsh warnings in tongues only the wise might guess. Nights they spent beneath the open stars or in shallow caves, keeping watch by turns while others slept. The darkness of the land seemed to press upon them, thick and tangible, as if the very earth remembered the long reign of Angmar and shuddered still at its memory. On the 12th night of their journey, as a cold wind howled from the north, they came upon the ruins of an ancient outpost, a ring of broken stones half buried in snow. Once it had been a watchtower of the Northmen, guarding the approaches to Carn. Now it lay desolate, a silent testament to the slow decay that had overtaken these lands. Thrallin ordered a halt, and the dwarves made camp within the crumbling walls. Fires were lit, small and well shielded, and sentries were posted at every breach. The air was tense, and many clutched their weapons even in sleep. At night, beneath a sky heavy with cloud, a voice was heard, thin and hollow, like the whisper of wind through a burial mound. It spoke no words any living ear could understand, but it chilled the marrow of those who heard it. Brimley, standing watch upon a shattered wall, saw a flicker of movement in the distance, a pale figure gliding over the snow, leaving no tracks. He gripped his axe tightly, but the thing faded into the mist before he could raise a cry. Come morning, the camp was astir with fearful murmurs. Tracks had been found, not of man nor beast, but of something else entirely, clawed and deep, circling the camp like a hungry wolf circling prey. Thrallin gathered his captains. His face was grim, but his voice was steady. The shadow still lingers, he said. It knows we are here. None spoke against him. They were dwarves, after all, proud, stubborn, and resolute. Fear might gnaw at their hearts, but it would not turn their feet from the path. They broke camp before dawn, moving swiftly now, weapons ever at the ready. The mountains loomed ahead, great and terrible, and nestled among them, hidden by cloud and snow, lay their goal, Carn. As they marched, the land grew ever more hostile. The sun was a dim blur behind layers of gray. The wind shrieked and tore at their cloaks. Sometimes they thought they heard voices carried on the gale, cries of anguish, laughter twisted into mockery, names of ancient kings spoken like curses. By the 15th day, they stood upon a rocky outcrop, gazing down at the valley of Carn. There it lay, a ruin of black stone and iron, its towers shattered, its gates broken, yet a malign presence seemed to seep from it still, like smoke from a smoldering fire. Dark shapes flitted among the ruins, and at the heart of it all, the great gate to the underhalls yawned wide, a mouth into endless night. Tolkien looked upon it and spoke, his voice low and steady. There lies the warren of the old evil. We shall cleanse it or fall in the attempt. The dwarves drew their axes, the sound sharp and cold in the heavy air, and with grim faces they began the descent into the shadowed vale. Thus began the battle for Carn, a tale of courage and sorrow, of loss and undying hope that would be told in the halls of dwarves for many ages to come. The path that led downward into the vale of Carn was rough and broken, little more than a scar upon the desolate face of the mountains, and the dwarves moved cautiously, for every step carried them deeper into the heart of the ancient evil that had long held sway over the north. Jagged stones jutted from the ground like the bones of some long-dead giant, and the wind moaned mournfully among them, carrying with it the sense of decay and old sorcery, heavy and oppressive. Around them the earth bore scars that no healing had ever touched, blackened patches where nothing grew, craters gouged by long-forgotten battles, and twisted remains of trees that had died in agony beneath the Witch King's shadow. Thrallin, ever at the fore, bore a great battle-axe that gleamed cold and bright even under the sullen sky, and his helm, wrought of darkened steel and adorned with the emblem of a roaring forge fire, caught the dim light and seemed to burn with an inner flame. Behind him came Gimli and Dane, and the host of dwarves stretched back along the slope like a living river of iron and stone, their faces set and grim, their hearts beating in time with the low, steady drum of their march. No song rose from their ranks, for they dared not summon cheer amid such a place. Only the clink of mail, the soft crunch of boots in frost, and the low murmur of commands disturbed the brooding silence. As they drew nearer to the broken walls of Carn, they saw that the fortress, though shattered and abandoned to the eye, was not without defenders. From the ruined towers and gaping gatehouses peered creatures not born of this world nor wholly of the next. Gaunt figures clad in ragged mail, their eyes burning with a pale and deathly fire, their movements slow yet filled with a dreadful purpose. These were the remnants of Angmar's host, not living men but wights, bound to the service of their fallen masters, animated by sorceries older than memory, and sustained by hatred undying. The dwarves halted at the edge of a crumbled causeway that led into the fortress, and for a moment there was no sound but the howl of the wind and the low creak of ancient gates swaying upon rusted hinges. Then Thrallin raised his axe high, and in a voice that rang clear and defiant against the heavy gloom, he cried aloud words in the tongue of his people, a challenge and a call to arms that stirred the blood of all who heard it. At his cry, the dwarves surged forward, their shields locked together, their axes gleaming like the teeth of some vast beast. They stormed the causeway, the air filling with the clash of steel upon steel, the hiss of arrows, and the hollow shrieks of the wights as they fell before the fury of the living. Though the wights were many and fought with a strength born of ancient malice, the dwarves pressed them back step by step, their battle line unbroken, their will as iron. Into the outer courtyard they battled, where great statues, once proud and terrible, lay toppled and broken upon the ground. Here the fighting grew fiercest, for the wights gathered in their greatest number, and from the deeper vaults of Carn came other things, creatures whose forms were lost in shadow, whose voices rasped like iron dragged across stone, yet the dwarves did not falter. Shield by shield, they forced their way forward, their axes hewing through darkened flesh and ancient bone, their war cries rising above the din like the tolling of great bells. Amidst the melee, Thrallin himself met in single combat a fell creature clad in armor black as night, its helm crowned with cruel spikes, its blade wreathed in a mist of cold flame. Whether it had once been a man or some other being twisted by the dark arts none could say, but its strength was terrible, and its malice a thing almost palpable. Blow after blow the two exchanged, and sparks flew from their clashing weapons, and the very ground beneath their feet seemed to shudder at the fury of their contest. Gimli and Dane fought back to back against a tide of lesser foes, their axes rising and falling in a deadly rhythm. Dane's shield was splintered by a great hammer blow, yet he caught the weapon upon the haft of his axe, and with a mighty heave cast its wielder down. Grimly, his helm dented and his cloak rent, fought like a storm unchained, and none could stand before the rage that burned in his heart. After what seemed a timeless age of battle, the outer courtyard was won. The wights lay scattered upon the stones, crumbling into dust even as the dwarves drove the last of them from the field. Blood, black and foul, stained the ground, and the air was heavy with the stench of sorcery. Yet though the field was theirs, the dwarves knew that their true task had only begun. Before them loomed the yawning entrance to the deep halls of Carn, from which no light shone and no sound issued save the faint, rhythmic throb of some unseen force, as if the very mountain had a heartbeat, slow and ponderous and filled with menace. It was into this darkness that they must go, to root out the evil that still clung to the ancient depths, like a spider in its web. Through them, his armor scored and his helm cast aside, leaned upon his axe and surveyed his warriors. Their faces were grim and weary, yet their eyes burned with the fire of the forge and the stubborn pride of their kind. He spoke no word, but raised his weapon high once more, and the dwarves answered with a low, thunderous chant, a song not of victory but of endurance, a song of stone and steel, of long memory and longer vengeance. Without delay, they formed their ranks anew and passed beneath the sundered gate, leaving behind the gray light of the dying day and plunging into the dark heart of Carn, where the true test of their courage awaited. For the halls of the Witch King were deep and treacherous, and within them stirred an evil that had neither slumbered nor forgotten, but had waited through long ages for the coming of the living. Thus did the dwarves enter the black halls, and thus was the second chapter of the battle for Carn begun, with iron in hand, fire in heart, and shadows gathering ever closer about them. The darkness that swallowed the dwarves as they passed beneath the broken gates of Carn was of a kind seldom encountered in the waking world, for it was not merely the absence of light, but a presence in itself, thick and clinging, a thing almost alive with malice. Their torches, though stout and well made, burned with a sickly flame, as if the very air resisted their efforts to drive back the gloom. And the walls, when they could be glimpsed, were slick with damp and covered in ancient runes, worn nearly to nothing by the passage of cruel centuries. The company advanced cautiously, their footsteps echoing hollowly along the vast, empty corridors, and the sound of their breathing seemed loud in their ears, each breath a visible mist in the chill that rose from the stones beneath their feet. Here and there they passed through halls whose ceilings soared high above their heads into unseen vaults, and in those places broken pillars lay scattered like the bones of fallen colossi, and the remnants of banners so faded that their colors and devices could no longer be discerned, hung in tatters from rusted chains. Thrallin led them ever forward, his heart a steady drumbeat of resolve, though in his mind he felt the weight of unseen eyes watching from the shadows. Many among the company felt it also, that oppressive gaze that seemed to strip away armor and will alike. But none spoke of their fear, for they knew that to give it voice would be to grant it power. So they marched in silence, save for the creak of leather and the muted clatter of steel, winding ever deeper into the ancient fortress where the Witch King's evil had once ruled unchallenged. At length, they came to a vast hall, greater than any they had yet seen, its walls lined with towering statues of black stone, warriors and kings of old, but their faces were cruel, and their poses proud and menacing. A dais stood at the far end, and upon it a great throne, wrought of iron and adorned with carvings so intricate and fell that many turned their eyes away rather than behold them. It was a place of power, still heavy with the memory of dark dominion, and as they crossed the threshold, a low whispering filled the air, as of countless voices murmuring just beyond the edge of hearing. It was Grimly who first beheld the thing upon the throne, and he uttered a cry of warning that rang sharply against the oppressive silence. For though the seat appeared empty at first glance, closer inspection revealed a figure seated there, shrouded in tattered robes of black and gray, its face hidden beneath a cowl, and its hands, or what passed for hands, resting lightly upon the arms of the throne. It did not move, nor did it speak, but from it radiated a cold and dreadful power that set the teeth of the dwarfs on edge, and made their blood run slow and heavy in their veins. Thrallin advanced cautiously, his axe held before him, and with a voice steady and clear, he addressed the figure, though his heart quailed within him. "Creature of shadow," he said, "we come not to parley, but to cast down the remnants of Angmar's evil. Yield now if aught of reason remains in thee, or face the wrath of the dwarves of the north." For a long moment there was no response, and the torches guttered and flickered as if in dread. Then, with a motion slow and deliberate, the figure raised its head, and from within the shadow of its hood gleamed 2 points of pale, baleful light. Eyes that were not eyes, but windows into a cold and deathless will. A voice spoke then, low and hollow, and though the words were clothed in a tongue forgotten by most, their meaning was plain, a promise of death, of ruin, and of the futility of all resistance. At that dread utterance, the statues that lined the hall stirred to life, stone cracking and groaning as they shed their ancient immobility and raised massive weapons forged of the same dark stone as themselves. From hidden alcoves and broken doorways poured creatures twisted by sorcery, gaunt, misshapen things that might once have been men, their flesh corrupted and their minds enslaved to the will of their dread master. The dwarves stood firm, forming a ring of shields around their leaders, and their war cry rose once more, defiant and fierce against the tide of darkness. Axes flashed, cleaving through stone and corrupted flesh alike, and the clash of battle filled the hall with a din like thunder trapped within a cavern. Grimly swung his great 2-headed axe in wide arcs, felling foes with every blow, while Dane, though wounded, fought on with grim determination, rallying those nearest him with words of courage and strength. Thorillin, his helm cast aside and his face grim and bloodied, engaged the Wraith Lord upon the throne. Their battle was unlike any other, for the creature wielded a blade of shadow that seemed to drink the light around it, and every blow it struck sapped the strength of those who bore its touch. Yet Thrallin, calling upon all the fire of his people's long memory and unyielding spirit, withstood the assault and drove the creature back step by step, until at last they stood upon the dais itself, the throne looming behind them like a spectre of ancient tyranny. With a great cry, Thraelin hewed mightily, and his axe, wrought by the finest smiths of the Iron Hills and tempered in the fires of vengeance, clove through the shadowy form. The Wraith Lord shrieked, a sound that tore at the ears and hearts of all who heard it, and the dark power that had sustained it began to unravel, fading into the air like smoke before a rising wind. The statues faltered, then crumbled into heaps of shattered stone, and the creatures of the dark fled, howling into the deeper shadows. Yet the victory came at a terrible cost. Many of the dwarves lay fallen among the ruins, their blood mingling with the dust of ages, and though the Wraith Lord was cast down, the fortress still pulsed with a lingering malevolence, as if the evil rooted in its stones could not be so easily undone. Breathing heavily, Thrallin stood upon the dais and looked out over the hall of battle. His heart was heavy with sorrow for the fallen, yet proud, too, for the valor they had shown. He raised his axe once more, and the surviving dwarves, battered and bloodied but unbowed, gathered around him. "This hall shall no longer be a refuge for darkness," Thrallin said, his voice carrying across the ruin. "Here we have struck a mighty blow, and here shall we stand until the last shadow is driven out." Thus ended the first great battle within the halls of Carn. But the war for the ancient fortress was far from over, and the deepest darkness yet lay ahead. When the last echo of battle had faded from the broken hall, and the wounded had been tended as best as might be in that grim and haunted place, the dwarves set themselves to the solemn work of honoring their fallen. They gathered their dead with care and reverence, laying them out beneath the shattered statues whose faces had once glared down with cruel pride, and there, by the dim light of failing torches, they sang the dirge of their people. A deep, sonorous chant that spoke of mountains lost and reclaimed, of battles fought and heroes fallen, of the enduring strength of stone and the memory that could not be erased by shadow or time. The song rose and fell like the breathing of the earth itself, and even the walls of Carn seemed to shudder beneath its ancient power, for there is a magic in grief that the dark does not easily withstand. And as the last note faded into the heavy air, the dwarves swore anew their oaths of vengeance and reclamation, binding their fates to the halls they sought to cleanse. It was Grimly who first spoke of the deeper ways, for he had marked, even in the heat of battle, that the throne room was but the outer chamber of a far greater labyrinth. Hidden doorways yawned in the gloom beyond the dais, and black stairways spiraled downward into the unseen deeps. It was said among the Lowmasters that the Witch King, in the pride of his power, had delved deep into the roots of the mountains, fashioning dungeons and forges and dark halls where unspeakable rites had been performed. If the true source of the lingering evil yet remained, it would be found not among the ruined towers, but in the blackness far below. There was no choice but to descend, though every heart among them quailed at the thought. Supplies were gathered, and the wounded, those who could not continue, were set to guard the upper halls, fortified behind makeshift barricades. Thrallin himself chose a company of the hardiest and most stalwart. Grimly, whose axe had felled a score of foes. Dane, though wounded, whose spirit burned undiminished, and many others whose names would be remembered in the songs of their kin for generations to come. They set forth in silence, the only light their torches sputtering bravely against the encroaching dark. Downward they went, the air growing colder and heavier with each step, until it seemed to press upon their chests like a great stone, and the walls wept with the slow tears of the mountain. They passed through vaults filled with broken relics of war, shattered swords, dented helms, rusted chains, grim reminders of battles long forgotten by the world above, but not by the stones of Carn. Deeper still they ventured, until the air grew so chill that frost formed upon their beards and mail, and every breath hung before them like a ghost. Strange sounds echoed in those halls, the creaking of ancient timbers, the distant drip of unseen water, and sometimes a low, rumbling groan that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth. yet no living thing did they meet, nor any sign of the foe, and this silence weighed more heavily upon their spirits than the clash of battle had done. In a cavern vast and hollow they came at last to a bridge of black stone, narrow and without railing, spanning a chasm so deep that no bottom could be seen, even when they dropped burning brands into its heart. Across that perilous span they must pass, though every step was fraught with peril, for a single misstep would plunge them into the abyss from which there would be no return. Thrallin crossed first, his steps steady and unhurried, and one by one the others followed, their hearts hammering within their chests. The bridge was slick with ice and treacherous to the foot, but the dwarves, masters of stone and tunnel, moved with care and skill. When at last all had reached the far side, they paused only briefly to catch their breath, for time was a foe no less deadly than the unseen dangers that awaited them. Beyond the chasm lay a gate of iron, ancient and wrought with runes that pulsed faintly with a light of their own. It was clear that here, in this place, forgotten by sun and star, the Witch King had worked his most potent sorceries. Grimly, whose forefathers had delved the deepest halls of the north, approached the gate and laid his hand upon the runes, feeling the chill seep into his very bone. With a muttered word of power and a mighty heave, the dwarves together forced the gate ajar, and a gust of foul air rushed forth, bearing with it the stench of death and things long rotted in darkness. They entered a hall unlike any they had yet seen, for its walls were not of worked stone, but of raw, living rock, black and glistening as if wet with unclean moisture. The ceiling arched high overhead, lost in shadow, and from unseen fissures issued a low, sibilant whispering that seemed to tug at the edges of the mind, weaving dreams of despair and madness. Here was no place made by dwarves or men, but a hollow born of malice and terror, a womb from which dark things might spring into the world. At the center of the cavern rose a great pillar, and about its base writhed shadows that no torch could dispel. Upon that pillar were carved sigils and symbols so old and so foul that even to look upon them brought pain to the eye and sickness to the heart, and there, encased within a shell of black crystal, hovered a figure. Once a man, perhaps, but now something altogether other, whose presence fouled the very air around it. This was the root of the evil that clung to Carn, the seed of shadow that had survived the fall of Angmar and taken new form in secret. The company drew back, their weapons raised, and for a moment they hesitated, for even the bravest among them could feel the ancient power that guarded the thing within the crystal. Yet Thrallin, his voice steady and clear, called out to his kin, reminding them of their oaths and of the blood that had been spilled. Slowly, grimly, they advanced, forming a ring about the pillar, and raised their axes high. Then the figure stirred, and a voice spoke, not with words heard by the ear, but with thoughts forced into the mind. A voice cold and mocking, filled with promises of death and despair. The crystal cracked and split, and the creature within began to emerge, its form shifting and writhing, as if not bound to any shape mortal eyes could endure. Thus began the final trial of the dwarves of the north in the deep halls of Carn, a battle not only of axe against sorcery, but of spirit against the very shadow that had once brought kings and kingdoms to their knees. As the black crystal shattered and the thing within it took form, the torches of the dwarves guttered and dimmed, as if recoiling from the foulness that now bled into the air. The creature was not as other beings of flesh and bone. It was a thing of shifting shadow and cruel, unfinished shape, a mockery of life clothed in the rags of forgotten kingship. And from its presence emanated a cold so profound that the breath of the dwarfs froze in their beards, and the iron of their mail grew brittle to the touch. Yet though every instinct of heart and mind cried out in terror, not one among them fled. For they were the sons of the mountain, and their hearts were tempered like the finest steel. Thrallin stood at the forefront, his axe held aloft, and in his voice rang the clear authority of one who bore the burden of ancient wrongs and the hope of future generations. By the blood of our fathers and the honor of our halls, he cried, we cast thee out, shadow of Angmar, defiler of the deep places. And with that cry, the dwarves advanced, their axes gleaming wanly in the sickly light, their shields locked together, forming a wall of living stone against the tide of corruption. The creature answered not with words, but with a scream that shattered the stillness like a hammer blow, a sound so piercing that the very stones of the cavern trembled and dust fell from the unseen heights above. It lashed out with tendrils of darkness, seeking to ensnare and consume, and where those tendrils touched the ground, the stone itself withered and cracked, as if life had been drained from it. Many of the dwarves faltered beneath the assault, their minds filled with visions of ruin and despair, of halls broken and kin fallen beneath an endless night. Yet still they pressed on, singing as they went a grim and ancient song that had carried their people through ages of sorrow and loss. Brimley, boldest among them, hurled himself at the creature's flank, his great axe whirling in mighty arcs, and where his blows fell the darkness recoiled, hissing and writhing like a thing wounded. Dane, though bloodied and weary, fought with the strength of 10 men, his shield raised high to turn aside the lashing tendrils, his war axe biting deep into the corrupt flesh when openings appeared. Around them the company closed ranks, each warrior lending his strength to his brother, and slowly, stubbornly, they drove the creature back toward the pillar from which it had sprung. Yet it was no mindless beast, but a thing of cunning malice, and as it fell back it gathered its strength anew, drawing upon the deep sorceries that yet lingered in the bones of Carn. A great wave of shadow burst forth from it, sweeping through the cavern with the force of a storm, and many were cast down, their torches extinguished, their cries lost in the tumult. Darkness engulfed the hall utterly, and for a moment it seemed that all was lost, that the dwarves would be swallowed by the ancient evil they had dared to challenge. But Thrallin, son of Thrain of the Iron Hills, whose spirit was as unyielding as the mountains themselves, rose up amid the ruin, bearing in his hand not torch nor blade alone, but a relic of elder days, a gem wrought in the hidden forges of Khazad-dûm, a light captured from the first fires of the world. This he held aloft, and the gem blazed forth with a brilliance that pierced the gloom like a sword of flame, casting back the shadows and revealing the true form of the creature, a twisted spirit, black and seething, bound still to the mortal world by chains of hatred and sorrow. At the sight of that light the dwarves rallied, lifting their voices in a song of defiance that shook the cavern to its roots. Khazad-ihub, they cried, the ancient war cry of their people, and with renewed strength they fell upon the creature. Blow after blow they struck, each axe finding its mark, each shield turning aside the desperate counterattacks of the beast. The pillar cracked and splintered beneath the onslaught, and from the sundered stone poured a black mist that shrieked and writhed before being consumed by the light of the gem. The creature howled one final time, a sound that seemed to rend the very fabric of the earth, and then, with a roar like the breaking of a dam, it was torn asunder, its form unraveling into motes of darkness that fled screaming into the cracks and crevices of the mountain, never to take shape again. Silence fell upon the hall, heavy and profound, and for a time none dared move or speak, for they stood upon the threshold of a great and terrible mystery, and the echoes of their triumph seemed to stretch out into the very bones of the world. At last Thrallin lowered the gem, and the light dimmed to a soft, steady glow. He looked upon his companions, and though they were wounded and weary, their faces were bright with the fierce joy of victory hard won. Grimly leaned heavily upon his axe, blood streaming from a dozen wounds, but he grinned broadly and let out a great shout of triumph that was taken up by the others, filling the shattered hall with the proud voices of the living. Yet, even in their victory, they knew that their task was not yet complete, for the fortress above still held remnants of evil, and the deep ways of Carn must be sealed lest the shadow take root anew. So they gathered their strength and made ready to return to the upper halls, bearing with them the wounded and the fallen, and the gem that had saved them, a light against the darkness that would guide them home. As they climbed the long stairways back toward the surface, the air grew lighter, and a faint breeze, cold but clean, stirred the musty gloom. Hope kindled anew in their hearts, and they spoke softly of the deeds they had done and of the songs that would be sung in their honor in the halls of the Iron Hills, in the lonely strongholds of the Grey Mountains, and perhaps even in far Erebor beneath the lonely mountain. Thus did the dwarves of the north begin their long return from the depths of Carn, their axes bloodied but unbroken, their spirits tempered in fire and darkness. Yet the story of their triumph was not yet fully told, for above them, unseen and waiting, other dangers stirred, and the final cost of their victory had yet to be reckoned. The long ascent through the bowels of Carn was a grim and wearisome trial, for the dwarves, though victorious, bore heavy burdens. The wounded leaned upon their comrades, the dead were carried with reverence upon shields fashioned into stretchers, and the weight of sorrow and exhaustion pressed upon every step. The torches that lit their path were few, and their flames burned low, for much of the oil had been spent in the deep battle, and so the company moved through a twilight world of shadows and fitful gleams, where every distant sound set the heart quickening, and every shifting darkness seemed to hold lurking menace. Yet the dwarves pressed on with the stubborn endurance of their kind, singing soft and solemn songs of the mountain folk, songs that spoke of hope enduring beyond the deepest dark, of halls restored and enemies cast down, and of the day when the sun would shine once more upon the high gates of stone. And in the singing they found strength, as did their fathers of old, when they marched through peril and despair. As they drew nearer to the upper levels, signs of disturbance grew about them. The stone passages they had passed in silence now bore marks of fresh scarring, walls splintered as if by great claws, doors wrenched from their hinges, and dark stains upon the ground that no wholesome thing had left. Shadows flitted at the edges of their sight, and sometimes a low growl or a sharp skittering would break the heavy stillness, though when they turned to face it, naught could be seen. At the vanguard, Thrallin walked, his axe still in hand, the light of the relic gem now fastened at his belt, casting a steady radiance that kept the deeper shadows at bay. Grimly walked at his side, limping but unbowed, and behind them came Dane and the stout-hearted warriors who had survived the battle in the black halls. Their faces were drawn with fatigue, but their eyes remained fierce, for they knew that the task they had set themselves was not yet ended, and the enemy, though broken, was not yet utterly destroyed. It was as they reached the outer vaults of Carn that the attack came. Without warning, the darkness itself seemed to spring to life, and from the broken halls and ruined chambers poured a host of fell creatures, things of twisted flesh and dark sorcery. The last desperate remnants of Angmar's corrupted brood. There were creatures that slithered and snapped, mockeries of beasts once known to the world, and there were others that walked upright but bore no true semblance of men, their faces masks of hatred and despair. With a great roar, Thrallin called his warriors to arms, and once more the dwarves formed their shield wall, the sound of their axes leaving their belts like the ringing of a great anvil struck. No quarter was given, and none asked, for in that hour the dwarves fought not merely for themselves, but for all the free folk of the north, to ensure that the evil of Carn should rise no more to trouble the world. The battle was fierce and desperate. The enemy came in waves, heedless of their own ruin, throwing themselves upon the shields and axes of the dwarves with a madness born of despair. Again and again the dwarves were driven back, their line bending but never breaking, for their wills were of iron and their axes flashed with a terrible light as they hewed through the darkness. Grimly fought like a storm unleashed, felling foes to right and left, his mighty axe a blur in the gloom. Dion, though sorely wounded, would not yield, and his shield, now cracked and blackened, turned aside many a blow that would have felled a lesser warrior. In the midst of the fray, Thrallin wielded the gemlight as a weapon, holding it aloft to burn away the deepest shadows, and where its radiance fell, the twisted creatures shrieked and withered, crumbling into ash and dust. Yet for every foe that fell, another seemed to spring from the broken earth, and it seemed for a time that the dwarves might be overwhelmed by sheer numbers, their strength worn away like a rock battered by endless waves. Pontumnus. But in that dark hour, when hope seemed ready to falter, the dwarves drew upon the ancient well of their people's endurance, a strength that had carried them through countless trials and the fall of kingdoms. They tightened their ranks, locking shields and moving as one, advancing step by step through the tide of foes, their song rising anew, fierce and terrible, a hammer blow of defiance against the night. Slowly, grimly, they drove the enemy back, clearing the halls and corridors one by one, until at last the remnants of the corrupted host fled shrieking into the depths, seeking to hide in the forgotten pits and secret burrows of the ruined fortress. The dwarves did not pursue, for their purpose was not to hunt every shadow, but to secure the halls above, and to ensure that no strength remained here to trouble the north in days to come. When the last blow had been struck, and the last cry of the foe had faded into the distant blackness, the dwarves gathered once more in the great courtyard beneath the open sky. It was night, and the stars wheeled in their ancient courses above, cold and clear, and the air was sharp with the chill of oncoming winter. Yet for all the cold, there was a cleanness in the air that had been absent before, as if some great miasma had been lifted from the land. And the dwarves lifted their faces to the heavens, and for the first time in many days, they smiled. Thrallin, standing before the shattered gates of Carn, raised his axe high in salute, and his voice, though hoarse with battle, rang out over the quiet ruins. By blood and fire, by stone and steel, we have reclaimed this place from the darkness. Let all who come after know that the dwarves of the north do not forget, and do not. A great cheer rose up from the company, and the mountains themselves seemed to echo their triumph, sending it rolling across the frozen wastes. Yet even in their victory, the dwarves did not forget their dead. They laid their fallen to rest in a hallowed place near the gate, raising cairns of stone over each, and setting runes of remembrance that would endure even when memory faded from the minds of living men. There, by the light of stars and the pale gleam of the gem, they held a final vigil, singing songs of honor and farewell, and the stones drank their words and bore them deep into the bones of the world, where they would endure for all the long ages yet to come. Thus was the outer fortress of Carndom reclaimed, and though the deeper halls remained a place of peril and haunting, the heart of the darkness had been broken, and a new hope stirred in the north. The days that followed the fall of Carndom were filled with toil and vigilance, for though the dwarves had broken the power that brooded within the fortress, they knew full well that evil, once rooted so deeply, does not yield easily to a single stroke. Therefore they set themselves to the hard labor of fortifying the upper halls, sealing with stone and fire the deeper passages that led into the black and perilous deeps where twisted things might yet lurk beyond reach, and raising strong barriers against the ruinous forces that might one day seek to reclaim the shadowed throne. By Thralin's command, the halls nearest the gate were cleansed and repaired, though the work was slow and heavy, for the stones themselves seemed reluctant to yield their secrets, and oftentimes when the masons set their tools against the ancient walls, strange noises echoed from within, the sighing of the earth, or the distant whisper of voices long dead. Yet the dwarves labored on, undaunted, for it was not in their nature to abandon a task once undertaken, and the memory of the battles they had fought burned like fire in their hearts. Their numbers had been sorely reduced by the struggle, and many of the finest among them now lay beneath cairns of stone, but those who remained were of sternest metal, and in hardship they found a grim companionship, a bond forged in darkness and tempered in blood. Often, as the cold winds howled about the shattered towers and the snow fell thick upon the broken courtyards, they gathered about great fires in the central hall, speaking softly of their homes far to the east, of the golden halls of Erebor and the strongholds of the Iron Hills, and in their songs and tales they wove new threads into the tapestry of their people's long memory. Yet for all their labor and courage, a shadow still lay upon Carndom. Strange lights were sometimes seen flickering among the ruins at night, and the watchers upon the walls spoke of voices carried upon the wind, calling in tongues that no living man could understand. Deep beneath the fortress, in places where none dared now to tread, something moved. Slow and ponderous, a remnant perhaps of that ancient darkness that even the light of the gem had not wholly destroyed. Turin knew in his heart that their victory, though great, was not complete, and that the roots of evil, though sundered above, yet gnawed at the bones of the mountain below. Therefore he called a council of his captains, gathering them in the repaired Hall of Banners, where once the Witch King's lieutenants had plotted their cruel wars. There, amid the dim light of braziers and the rough-hewn stone, he spoke to them of his purpose. "This place," he said, "cannot be held as we would hold a true hall of our people, It bears the scars of sorcery too deep to cleanse in our time, and to dwell here would be to invite the slow corruption that devours from within. Yet neither can we abandon it wholly, lest the evil fester anew and spread across the north as it did in the dark days of old. Therefore we shall make of Carndom a tomb and a warning. We shall seal the deeper ways, wall up the secret doors, and set wards of stone and steel against all who would enter. Let it be a place of silence and sorrow, where the memory of Angmar's terror may wither and die under the weight of the years. Many murmured in assent, for they had seen too much to believe that the fortress could ever again serve as a true stronghold of light. Yet there were some among the younger dwarves who grumbled in discontent, for they had dreamed of reclaiming these halls as their own, of forging a new kingdom in the ruins of the old. But Thrallin, wise beyond his years and tempered by hard experience, knew that some wounds cut too deep to be healed by strength of arms alone. Thus the work began in earnest. Great slabs of stone were hauled into place by teams of dwarves working in concert, and the lower halls were sealed with doors bound in iron and locked with runes of warding. Towers that had once served as watchposts for the Witch King's minions were toppled, their stones cast down to choke the roads and paths that led to the fortress, so that no great host might easily approach in days to come. And all the while the seasons turned and winter deepened its hold upon the land. Snow fell in thick, endless veils, burying the scars of battle beneath a cloak of white, and the mountains stood silent and watchful, their peaks crowned with ice. The dwarves, clad in furs and mail, labored by torchlight and moonlight, never ceasing in their task, until at last the fortress was made as safe as mortal craft could contrive. When the work was done and the last stone set, Thraelin called the company together one final time in the courtyard beneath the broken arch of the gate. There, standing upon a great stone dais fashioned from the fallen remains of the Witch King's throne, he spoke words of farewell and remembrance, words that would be carried by the wind to the farthest corners of the mountains. "Here we have fought, and here we have prevailed," he said, his voice strong, though sorrow weighted it. "Let the world remember that the dwarves of the north do not forget their wrongs, nor forsake their oaths. Let it be known that we stood against the shadow and endured. Though this place shall know no laughter nor forge song, it shall also know no dominion of darkness." And with that, they set their final seals upon the gates of Carn Dum, great plates of iron engraved with runes of warning and strength, and they turned their faces eastward toward their distant homes. Their steps were slow, for many bore wounds that would ache for the rest of their days, and each step away from the fortress felt like the lifting of a great burden from their hearts. As they passed out of the valley and into the cold, starlit wastes beyond, the sky above them cleared, and the first pale gleam of dawn touched the highest peaks of the gray mountains. It was a cold and fleeting light, yet it seemed to promise that even in the bitterest places, even in the darkest hours, hope might yet endure. Thus did the dwarves of the north depart from Carn Dum, leaving behind them a silent tomb and a stern warning to all who would seek power through the paths of darkness. Their tale would be told in halls of stone and hearths of fire, sung by deep voices in the long winter nights, a song of sorrow and defiance, of loss and undying hope. Long was the road that led eastward, and bitter was the winter that laid its hand upon the land, for the snows fell ceaselessly from a pale and sunless sky, and the cold bit deep through cloak and mail, turning breath to mist and stiffening fingers upon axe haft and shield strap. And yet the dwarves pressed on, grim and unyielding as the mountains themselves, their hearts fortified by the memory of their deeds and by the knowledge that the shadow behind them had been broken by their courage and sacrifice. Through valleys where the snow lay deep and treacherous, across frozen rivers that groaned under their weight, and over jagged passes where the wind howled like wolves at the gate, they journeyed without faltering, sustained by the strong fellowship born of shared struggle and by the songs they sang to keep the weariness at bay. Thrallin, who had led them into the darkness and back again, strode at their head, his axe slung across his back, and the light gem, now dimmed to a gentle glow, fastened at his belt. His face was lined with care and marked by the scars of battle, yet his step was firm, and in his bearing there was a quiet pride that no hardship could undo. Beside him marched Grimly, whose laughter, though rough and hoarse, rang out across the snow like the roll of distant thunder, and Dane, ever steadfast, who bore his wounds in silence and spoke little, though the fire in his eyes burned undiminished. At times, as they paused to rest in sheltered hollows or beneath the overhang of ancient crags, Thrallin would look back toward the west, where the mountains reared their white and distant crests against the gray horizon, and a shadow would pass over his face. For though they had won a victory and left Carn sealed behind them, he knew that evil was not so easily vanquished from the world, and that elsewhere in Middle-earth the long struggle between light and darkness went on, often unseen and unheralded, and that one day his people might once again be called upon to take up arms in its defense. Thus the company moved eastward, each day bringing them nearer to the lands of their kin, and with each league their spirits grew lighter, for the signs of desolation gave way to the more familiar hardships of the northern wilds, the lonely cry of hawks wheeling in the cold sky, the tracks of deer and wolf upon the snow, and the dark lines of distant forests sleeping beneath their white mantles. And when at last they came upon the western marches of the Iron Hills, the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in many weeks, casting a golden light upon the world and setting the snow to sparkling like a sea of stars. There, in a sheltered valley where the winds were stilled and the ground was firm beneath their feet, Thrallin called a halt, and the dwarves made camp with glad hearts, for the end of their journey was in sight. Fires were kindled, and meat was roasted over the flames, and though their supplies were thin, and their bodies weary, they ate and drank with a joy born of survival and hard-won peace. Songs were sung, low and rough at first, but rising as the night wore on into great choruses that rang among the hills and sent the beasts of the wild fleeing into the shadows. As the firelight flickered against the snow and the stars wheeled overhead in their bright and ancient courses, Thrallin stood apart, gazing into the flames, and many thoughts passed through his mind. He thought of the halls of his forefathers, deep and strong beneath the mountains, and of the treasures wrought by cunning hands and guarded by proud hearts. He thought of the friends he had lost, and of the stones raised in their memory at the gates of Carn. He thought, too, of the road yet to come, for though they had won a respite, he knew that the world beyond the Iron Hills was stirring, and that new perils might yet arise from the ashes of the old. Grimly came to stand beside him, nursing a battered mug of warmed ale, and for a time they said nothing, content to share the silence of comradeship. At length Grimly spoke, his voice low and roughened by the cold. "It was a bitter fight we waged," he said, "and a dear price we paid. Yet I think no dwarf shall ever pass through those halls again without knowing who we are and what we have done." Thrallin nodded, his gaze still fixed upon the dancing flames. "Aye," he said, "and let it be a warning to all who would seek to raise again the banners of darkness. The dwarves do not forgive easily, nor do we forget." Thereafter the camp settled into slumber, with sentries posted to watch the snowy night, and the dwarves wrapped themselves in their cloaks and lay beneath the stars, their dreams filled with visions of hearth and home, of roaring fires and the scent of stone and earth and forge. The land around them was silent, save for the crackle of the fires and the occasional whisper of wind among the rocks, and it seemed for a time that peace had returned to that lonely corner of the world. In the morning they broke camp and set out once more, their pace quickened by the nearness of their goal. And as they marched, the high, proud walls of the iron hills rose before them, crowned with snow and glittering in the pale winter sun. And from the heights there came the sound of horns blowing, deep and sonorous, welcoming their kin home. Thus the company of Thrallin, battered and diminished yet triumphant, returned at last to their people, and the tale of their deeds spread swiftly among the halls of stone. Songs were made and sung in their honor, and their names were carved into the great tablets that recorded the histories of the dwarfs, that their valor should not be forgotten even in the farthest reaches of time. Yet for all the honors heaped upon him, Thrallin bore his laurels with humility, knowing that the truest victories are those purchased not with glory, but with sacrifice. He took no title nor seat of rule, but returned instead to the simple life of his fathers, laboring in the forges and teaching the young the ways of stone and steel, instilling in them the memory of what had been won and at what cost. And so the shadow over Carn was broken, and for a time the north knew peace, and the dwarves, ever proud and unbowed, added a new chapter to the long, storied saga of their people, a chapter written in fire and blood, but also in hope and in the enduring strength of the mountain heart. Though the snows of many winters came and went, and the seasons turned in their long and patient circles over the lands of the north, the memory of the march to Carn and the deeds of Thrallin's company did not fade from the hearts of the dwarves, for in every hall and under every mountain where their kindred dwelt, the tale was told anew by the firesides when the winds howled in the night and the mountains groaned under the burden of ice, a tale of grim valor and the breaking of ancient evil, of courage that did not falter, though the shadow loomed vast and terrible above them. In the iron hills, the name of Thrallin was spoken with reverence, not as one who had sought glory for himself, but as one who had borne the burden of his people's long sorrow and had wrestled with darkness for their sake alone. Yet for all the honor accorded him, he lived simply, as he had always done, forging blades and armor of great craft, teaching the young ones the lore of stone and steel, and often walking alone among the hills where the winds spoke in forgotten tongues to those who would listen. But the world beyond the dwarves' strongholds was not so still. Far to the west and south the free peoples of Middle-earth stirred, for though the north knew a brief peace, the greater struggle against the shadow that ever sought to return had not ended. Dark tidings sometimes reached the iron hills, of restless things moving in the deep forests, of silent cities where once laughter had rung, of dark shapes seen upon the marches in the moonless nights. And though the dwarves were a folk slow to fear and slower still to flee, They knew that their victory at Carn was but a single battle in a war that had been waged since the elder days, and would not end until the world itself was changed. Often, when the snows lay thick upon the hills and the nights were long and cold, Thrallin would sit alone before the forge, his hammer silent upon the anvil, gazing into the fire, as if seeking in its depths some glimpse of things yet to come. His thoughts would wander to the halls of Carn, now sealed and silent, and to the black depths they had left untouched, and he would wonder if, even now, some fragment of the ancient malice still lingered, hidden and patient, awaiting its hour to rise once more. Yet though such thoughts troubled him, he did not speak of them often, for he knew that to dwell too long upon shadows was to give them strength. Grimly, who had been his steadfast companion through all perils, remained near, and together they would sometimes climb the high places of the Iron Hills, standing shoulder to shoulder as they looked out over the vast wintry world. Grimly, for all his bluntness and fierce spirit, had a heart as deep as the roots of the mountains, and often he would speak of hope, of the young dwarves growing strong in craft and courage, of the day when the halls would ring with new songs of triumph, and the dark places of the earth would be cleansed of their ancient stains. Jane, too, though bearing the scars of battle both seen and unseen, rose to great renown among his people, and his counsel was sought in all matters of war and defense. Yet he, like Thrallin, bore within him a quiet wariness, a sense that the world's great tales were not ended, and that the dwarves must be ever vigilant, lest they wake one day to find the shadows at their gates once more. Thus the years passed, and the tale of Carn became part of the living memory of the dwarves, woven into their songs and their histories, a shining thread of valor in the long tapestry of their people. Children born after the battle grew up hearing of Thrallin and his company, of the march through the bitter wastes, the battle in the black halls, and the sealing of the ancient fortress. And though few now had ever seen Carn with their own eyes, it lived on in the hearts and dreams of those who cherished the old ways. And yet, beyond the high walls and the deep mines of the Iron Hills, the wild remained wild, and the mountains whispered to one another in voices of stone and snow, and the lonely wind carried on its back secrets that no ear could fully hear. Travelers who dared venture into the far north spoke of strange sights, of ruins half buried in ice where pale lights flickered at midnight, of broken towers that stood alone upon the plain like watchmen of a forgotten age, and of deep places where no bird sang and no beast dared tread. Some among the dwarves dismissed these tales as the fancies of frightened men, but others, wiser in the lore of the ancient days, listened more carefully, and they remembered the words of the old songs, that evil, though defeated, is a seed that seldom dies, and that even in its ruin it can cast long and deadly shadows. Thus a quiet vigilance grew among the dwarves, and though they did not live in fear, they kept their weapons sharp and their watchfires burning, and they taught their young ones not only the arts of stonecraft and metalwork, but the songs of battle and the lore of the dark times, lest they be caught unawares when the world darkened once more, and in the deepest nights, when the wind howled through the narrow passes and the stars gleamed cold and distant overhead, some would remember Carn and the darkness that had once poured forth from its gates, and they would give silent thanks to those who had faced the shadow and had not faltered, and who had left behind them a light that not even the long winter of the world could extinguish. Thus the name of Thrallin and his companions endured, shining like a steadfast star in the long memory of the dwarves, a beacon of hope and defiance against the dark. Yet, though many winters had passed, and the hills lay blanketed in deep and silent snow, the memory of Carn did not lie altogether in peace. For among those who dwelt far from the strongholds of the dwarves, whispers began to stir, faint and fleeting at first, like smoke curling in a cold wind, but growing in strength and daring as the years wore on. Strange tales came from the northernmost reaches of Middle-earth, borne by wandering hunters and weathered wayfarers who dared the forgotten paths. Tales of a sickness creeping through the wild things, of wolves that walked with eyes like pale coals, of shadows moving with purpose across the frozen plains where none should tread. Few gave heed at first, for the world was wide and its corners dark, and men, ever busy with their own toils and struggles, often turned their faces from matters that did not press upon their doors. Yet among the wise, the lore masters of Rivendell, the rangers of the north, and the most ancient of the dwarves who still remembered the black days of Angmar, a disquiet grew, and questions were spoken in low voices in the firelit halls. Had all the evil of Carn been truly vanquished, or had some part of it, subtle and patient, endured in secret, waiting for the day when mortal vigilance would falter and it might rise anew? In the Iron Hills, Thrallin, though aged now and his beard touched with silver, remained ever watchful, though his hands, once swift and strong upon the anvil, had grown slower with the passing of years. The fire within him had not dimmed, and his spirit, honed upon the forge of hardship and memory, remained as keen as the blades he had once carried into battle. Oft he would stand upon the high terraces of the hills, gazing westward where the mountains lay in their endless silence. And though his lips spoke no word of it, his heart was troubled. Brimley, who had grown stout and thick of voice with age, still sat often by the fireside, recounting the old tales to the young ones who gathered wide eyes to hear of the march to Carn and the battle in the black halls. But when the night was deep and the fires burned low, even he would fall silent, lost in memories that weighed heavily upon the soul. Dian, too, though he had risen to high honor among the dwarves, bore the marks of that ancient struggle, and when the winds from the north blew chill and bitter, he would feel the ache of old wounds, and remember the dark halls of stone where they had fought and bled. It was in the deep of one such winter, when the snows lay thick upon the world, and the sky was but a dome of gray iron, that a messenger came to the Iron Hills. A man of the north, clad in heavy furs, his face lined with hardship and fear, who sought audience with the elders of the dwarves. He brought tidings grim and urgent, that strange creatures were abroad once more in the northwestern marches, not men, not beasts, but things of shadow and hate, that travelers vanished without trace, that villages were found empty, their fires cold and their doors swinging open upon the wind. At these words, a deep silence fell upon the gathered dwarves, and the firelight flickered across grim faces and furrowed brows. Thrallin listened without interruption, his eyes shadowed by thought, and when the messenger had finished, he rose slowly to his feet, his bearing still proud, though the weight of many years pressed upon him. "This we knew might come," he said at last, his voice low but unwavering. "The shadow was broken, but not utterly destroyed. Its roots are deep and dark, and they thirst ever for the light. If it stirs again, it must be faced, lest the world fall into ruin once more. Thus it was that another council was called, and the dwarves of the Iron Hills, though fewer now and heavy with age, girded themselves once more for the road. They spoke not of conquest nor of glory, but of duty and remembrance, for they knew well the cost of hesitation and the price that must be paid if evil were allowed to flourish unchecked. A new company was formed, smaller than that which had marched to Carn before, but no less resolute, warriors seasoned by hardship, smiths whose hammers could forge weapons of great might, and younglings eager to prove themselves worthy of the heritage that had been handed down to them. Thrallin, though many urged him to remain behind, refused to be left idle, and though he would not lead in battle as he had of old, he would go with them, a guide and a witness, to ensure that the lessons bought so dearly were not forgotten. Thus they made ready once again, and the old songs were sung anew, not songs of feasting and triumph, but of long roads and heavy burdens, of the enduring spirit that no shadow could overcome. The horns of the Iron Hills were sounded, and their echoes rolled out across the frozen plains, carrying the news to friend and foe alike that the dwarfs of the north had not forgotten and would not forsake their watch. As the company set forth under the pale light of a waning moon, the world around them seemed to hold its breath. The land lay cloaked in silence, and the stars gleamed cold and pitiless overhead. But the dwarves marched on, their axes and mail glinting in the moonlight, their steps steady and sure upon the snow. And though none could yet say what they would find at the end of the long road, nor whether they would return again to their halls, they went with hearts full of the old defiance, bearing with them the memory of those who had fought before them, and the hope that even in the darkest places the flame of courage might yet be kindled anew. Thus the tale of Carn, though thought ended by many, began once more to weave its shadowed thread through the tapestry of Middle-earth. Long and weary was the road that the company of dwarves now traveled, and though their hearts were stout and their wills as iron, yet the land itself seemed to conspire against them, for the winter was cruel beyond any in living memory, and the snows fell thick and heavy from a leaden sky that knew neither sun nor star. The rivers they came upon were frozen deep, their waters imprisoned beneath sheaths of black ice. The forests stood silent, their branches heavy with rime, and no bird sang, nor beast stirred save those born of harder stuff than flesh, and even these were gaunt and desperate, their eyes gleaming with a cold hunger that knew no reason. Yet the dwarves pressed on, forging a path through the drifts with axe and fire, raising tents of heavy leather when the winds grew too fierce to bear, and kindling great fires that crackled and hissed in the snow-laden night. They spoke little as they marched, husbanding their breath against the biting air, but at the close of day, when the campfires were lit and the meat was set to roast, songs were sung once more, low and slow, the deep harmonies of their people rolling out across the darkened hills like the voice of the earth itself, a defiance against despair. Thrallin, though age had bowed his shoulders and silvered his beard, seemed to draw strength from the hardship, and his presence among them was like a beacon, steady and enduring, a living reminder of what had been achieved before and what might yet be won. Often he would walk among the camp, speaking words of encouragement to the young ones, recalling the deeds of old, and reminding them that they were the sons of kings and smiths, heirs to a heritage of stone and flame that no winter of the world could wither. Thus, by slow stages, they made their way westward, passing through desolate lands where once proud towns had stood, now nothing more than broken stones half buried in ice, and over wide plains where the bones of beasts long dead jutted from the snow like the fingers of giants reaching toward a pitiless sky. Strange sights they beheld, too. Faint lights glimmering upon distant hills, the outline of towers crumbling into the night, and once a procession of ghostly shapes, cloaked and hooded, moving silently across a frozen lake, vanishing before any could give them chase or challenge. At length, after many days of hardship and toil, they came within sight of the mountains of Angmar, grim and terrible against the stormy sky, their peaks lost in cloud and their lower slopes dark with pine and ancient stone. Here the wind carried with it a different scent, not the pure cold of untainted snow, but a corruption that soured the air and set the skin to crawling, as if something unseen watched and waited among the rocks. The dwarves halted upon a high ridge and looked down into the valley beyond, and there, before them, lay the ruins of Carn. Time and the bitter breath of winter had gnawed upon its walls and toppled its towers, so that it seemed less a fortress than the skeleton of some vast and malignant beast, long dead, yet unburied. The gates they had sealed still stood, black against the white of the snow, but the land about them was not as they had left it, for dark shapes moved among the stones, and faint fires flickered in the deep places where no light ought to be. A great silence fell upon the company as they beheld this sight, and many felt a chill greater than the cold of the wind pass over them, as if the very memory of the shadow that had once ruled here rose up to challenge their coming. Yet Thrallin, standing tall despite his years, spoke with a voice that cut through the gloom. "Here lies the wound we thought to close," he said, "but it festers still, and if left untended it shall spread its poison once more across the north. Let us go down as we did in days of old, with axes bared and hearts unyielding, and let us finish what was begun, lest all our labor come to naught." And so they made ready, checking their weapons and tightening the straps of their armor, speaking little, for each knew that the hour was grave and that many among them might not see the rising of another sun. They descended the slope in silence, the snow muffling their steps, until they stood once more before the iron gates of Carn, now blackened with frost and age, but still bearing the runes and seals they had set there long ago. It was grimly, grown grayer and heavier with the passing of years, but still fierce in spirit, who first stepped forward and placed his hand upon the gate. At his touch, a deep groan echoed through the stones, and a thin line of darkness spread from beneath the door, as if the very fortress sensed their presence and stirred uneasily in its long slumber. Without hesitation, Thrallin drew forth the light gem once more, and though its radiance had dimmed over the years, it flared now with a steady, pure light that cast back the shadows and illuminated the faces of the dwarfs, grim and resolute beneath their helms. At the sign of the gem, the gates shuddered and the seals cracked, not with the violence of rupture, but with a slow, sorrowful yielding, as if some great spirit, long imprisoned, sighed its last, The gates swung inward, revealing a darkness beyond, deeper than night itself, a darkness that seemed to breathe and whisper, promising death and despair to all who entered. Yet the dwarves did not falter. With Thrallin at their head and Grimly and Dane close behind, they passed into the gloom, their torches flickering bravely against the vast and ancient cold. The halls of Carn lay in ruin, their walls split by frost and their ceilings sagging with the weight of centuries, yet the malice that had been born here had not wholly fled. It clung to the stones and seeped from the cracks, an unseen mist that clouded the mind and weighed upon the heart. Strange cries echoed through the passages, and fleeting shapes flitted in the corners of vision, always vanishing before they could be brought to bay. Yet forward they went, the sound of their boots ringing hollow on the cold stone, until they reached the great hall where once the Witch King's throne had stood. There, amid the shattered remnants of the past, they beheld a sight that chilled them to their marrow. For upon the dais, where once had sat a creature of shadow and fear, there now stood a figure robed in black, its face hidden beneath a helm wrought in the likeness of a screaming wraith, and in its hand it bore a staff of iron crowned with a shard of dark crystal, pulsing with a sickly light. The figure raised its staff and spoke in a voice that was not a voice, a sound that seemed to come from the stones themselves, cold and merciless. "You have returned, children of stone," it said. "But you come too late. The seed was planted long ago, and though you crushed the bough, the root yet thrives. You shall not leave these halls again." And so, in the ruins of Carn, beneath the weeping stones and the weight of forgotten ages, battle was joined once more, and the fate of the North would hang upon the edge of axe and will and the unyielding hearts of the dwarves of the Iron Hills. Then a great cry was raised among the dwarves, a cry born not of fear but of wrath, deep and resonant, like the breaking of mountains or the awakening of fire within the heart of the earth. And they lifted their axes high and charged across the broken floor of the hall, their mail flashing, and their voices joined in a battle song that echoed from the shattered vaults above and sent a tremor through the very bones of the fortress. The dark figure upon the dais did not flee nor flinch, but raised its staff high, and from the iron crown a wave of black sorcery leapt forth, a flood of shadow that sought to choke the torches and smother the light, to steal the breath from their lungs and the courage from their hearts. Yet Thrallin, whose spirit had been tempered by the fires of many trials, stood firm at the head of his people, and drawing forth the gem of light that had once banished the Wraith Lord in the deeps below, he held it aloft, and it blazed forth like a star fallen from the heavens, driving back the tide of darkness and cleaving a path through the swirling mists. At that light, the dark figure faltered, and for a moment the hall shuddered as if the very stones recoiled from the clash of power. Grimly was first to reach the dais, his great axe flashing in the flickering light, and with a roar he struck at the figure, but the blow was turned aside by an unseen force, and Grimly was thrown back, staggering but unbroken. Then came Dane, grim and implacable, and others too, their blows hammering against the shield of sorcery that surrounded the dark sorcerer, and with each stroke the light of the gem flared brighter, and the barrier of shadow shrank and shivered like ice beneath the hammer. Then Thrallin himself stepped forward, his axe gleaming like a shard of the sun, and with a mighty cry he smote the iron staff, and it shattered with a sound like the rending of the world. The figure gave a shriek, thin and piercing, and its form seemed to unravel, the black robes whipping about it as if torn by a fierce wind. And from within there came a flash of something pale and withered, a thing that had once been a man but was now no more than hatred given shape. The dwarves pressed forward, their axes biting deep, and at last the figure fell, and the crystal shard at its crown splintered into dust, and the hall was filled with a great gust of wind, cold and clean, as if the mountain itself drew a deep and healing breath. The torches flared high, their light steady and pure, and the oppressive gloom that had lain upon Carn dumb since the elder days was broken at last. For a long while the dwarves stood in silence, the echoes of the final battle still lingering in the air. And then, slowly, they lowered their weapons, and a deep murmur rose among them, a sound of wonder and relief, of sorrow and triumph mingled as one. Thrallin knelt where the figure had fallen, and there, amid the dust and ruin, he placed the gem of light, now dim and cracked from its long struggle, and he spoke words of farewell, not to the darkness, but to the memory of all who had fallen in the long wars against it. "This place shall be a tomb and a warning," he said, his voice ringing clear in the vastness of the hall. "Let none seek to raise again that which was broken, nor to rouse the shadows that sleep beneath the earth. By the blood of our fathers, by the fire of our forges, by the oaths that bind us still, we have set our seal upon this place. Let it be forgotten by the world, save in song and story, as a reminder of what was overcome, and what must never be allowed to return." Thereafter they set about their final work, sealing the deep halls with stone and iron, carving runes of warding and remembrance into the very walls, and raising great cairns over the entrances, so that none might enter unbidden. They tore down what remained of the Witch King's fortress, leaving only broken stones to mark the place where once great evil had sat enthroned. And they set great beacons of stone at the edges of the valley, cairns crowned with axes and shields, so that any who wandered into that forsaken land would know that here lay peril and a past better left undisturbed. When all was done, and the winter sun cast a pale and fleeting light upon the frozen land, the company turned eastward once more, weary but victorious, bearing with them the memory of deeds that would live long after the stones of Carn had crumbled into dust. They sang as they went, not songs of glory, but songs of endurance and remembrance, songs that spoke of sorrow endured and hope preserved through the long night of the world. And so they came at last to the Iron Hills, where their kin greeted them with joy and sorrow mingled. For though they returned victorious, not all who had set out now walked among them. The names of the fallen were carved in stone and sung by deep voices in the halls of their fathers, and the story of their march and their battle was woven into the great tapestry of the dwarves, a story of defiance and sacrifice, of darkness faced and overcome. Thrallin, though he lived many years thereafter, would never again take up axe or mail, for he had fought the last battle that fate had set before him, and he was content to dwell in peace, teaching the young the old songs and the hard lessons that his people could never afford to forget. And when at last he passed beyond the circles of the world, they laid him in a tomb of stone beneath the mountains he had loved, and over it they carved in runes of deep and shining silver the words, "Here lies Thrallin, son of the Iron Hills, breaker of shadows, keeper of oaths. Long may his memory endure, while stone stands and the mountains walk the world." Thus ended the tale of the dwarves' war against the lingering darkness of Carn Dum. And though the world would see many more shadows rise and fall before its ending, yet for a time in that far and rugged corner of the north, the free peoples of Middle-earth knew peace, bought dearly and guarded well, and the light that had been kindled by steadfast hearts shone forth into the long twilight, a beacon against the returning night.